I'm Mike Costello, and I'm here with the Reverend Iris Freelander. And today we'd like to talk to you about the laws of karma, or cause and effect. Many people have a variety of ideas about karma and what it is. A lot of people from Western religious traditions have misconceptions or maybe misunderstandings about karmic law. And so we'd like to spend the next few minutes talking to you about the concept and the idea and how it integrates to Western theology and Western belief. Iris, why don't we begin by talking about karma, what it is?
Wonderful. Well, the law of, as you said, karma is the law of cause and effect. As ye sow, so shall you reap. And so it's neither negative nor positive, it just is. And a lot of people put a negative connotation on karma, thinking, well, that's just my karma when something bad happens. Well, it's just their karma when something good happens too. Because everything we do, every thought we have, every act, every thought, every deed is recorded in the Akashic records. And it's not like someone on the inner planes is keeping a record and keeping a tally like bookkeepers do. But that is recorded, and then we repay for the deeds we've done or are repaid. And that's a very simplistic way to put it, as you know.
Mm-hmm. And the cause and effect that we're talking about is not only, as you said just a minute ago, the things that we do, but also the things that we think.
Right.
And so as we create either positive thoughts or negative thoughts, we create a karmic response to what happens.
Correct. And just because someone has something bad happen in their life doesn't mean they've created a negative karma in the past. It might mean they're working through for someone else some problem, and because of the problem they encounter, well, then that might be helpful to another person to relive their to relieve themselves of karma. I know that happens in families so very much, and that happened. I've had that brought home to me very clearly from various ones from the inner planes in relation to my daughter who died when she was 3. And I kept thinking, what did I ever do in the past to have merited having that happen in my life? Well, that's not an important question. It's not important because it's not necessarily what I did, and that's what various ones have told me that it isn't. And you see, it's like a tapestry, and life is interwoven. Our lives are interwoven, and it could be when one person dies, it can affect many, many people in many, many ways. So most of us are too self-centered in that respect. We think everything is something we've done, whether it's good or bad. That's not necessarily so.
And it's very important to realize that point that we're all part of the whole, and that Iris Freelander and Mike Costello and John Smith and Mary Jones, all of the people that are on planet Earth, the multiple millions of people, make up the consciousness of this planet and move through the experiences of life. So we're all interconnected. And so often we look at individual responsibility, principally, I think, because from our Western theology in traditional Christianity, we're taught so often that we come in with a negative aspect of original sin, and then we are constantly dealing with the battle between good and evil, sin and goodness. And we look to ourselves and look to the consequences of our individual actions. And certainly our individual actions are important, but there are also the actions and reactions of others that we have no control over or knowledge of.
Right, and we need to keep that in mind as we're looking at our own karma and our own obligations in life to see where we're going and where we've been and what we need to do. Because again, it's all, as you said so very well, it's all so interwoven that what we need to do is what you teach so well, is live in the now. That's the important part. And it's good to look to the past and see what we can see that has happened in other lives and in other times in this life. And as you know, I do past life therapy work, and I know that you do a lot of counseling in that way. But the important thing is just living in the now. It's our intent that makes the difference karmically. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. And so it's our intent that registers in the Akashic records to our credit or to our discredit.
Mm-hmm. And important in this concept is that in New Thought and in metaphysical theology, we're talking about the fact that it isn't God that is judging what's taking place on planet Earth or in individual lives, but it is the cause and effect of individual lives and cumulative lives gathered together. And so it's really consequences that are brought about because of actions, because of deeds, because of thoughts, because of words that create a cycle that has to be met in the physical life and in the spiritual life. And it isn't God sitting up there judging the world, much like we've been taught.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And you presented that so very clearly, and the cumulative lives is so important because on the inner, after we go over, we're not only that aspect of being that we were in our last life, we're also the cumulative lives of all lifetimes we have had on earth. And so we're, in essence, working as two individuals, but as one.
Mhm.
It's just like some person might be a husband or wife or a bookkeeper in an office or a member of a club. Well, I'll speak from my own viewpoint, a member of a club, member of several different things, and we're different things to different people. Well, all those together make up what we are in this life today. Well, that same thing would be true on the inner. The person they were in that one specific lifetime is gathered together with all the energies of the who they were in other lives and what they did and the knowledge they had. And it's the knowledge that's most important. It's not the good and bad deeds that are so very important. And as you said, God doesn't judge. We judge ourselves, and we know that for sure from all the near-death experiences that so many people have brought back. And that's very important that we realize that God is love. God doesn't judge.
Not a judging God, but a God who sets into motion the laws that operate, and that God's feeling about us never changes.
Exactly.
God loves us no matter what, and He loves everyone no matter what. And so because of that, the issue of sin and punishment really need to be clarified in people's minds, and the idea of cause and effect, rather than sin and punishment, need to be included in the thought process of the West. And of course, today we see so many wonderful truths from Eastern religions and faiths being brought to the West, and the meshing of both East and West in theology and in all other areas as well. And in that process, I think that the issues of karma, and I even stay away a little bit from the word karma because so many people have negative feelings about that, but moving from sin and punishment to cause and effect, that there is a cause, there is an action, and that there is an effect for that action or that thought, and that those laws operate and they go on eternally. And we have control over them, but some of those issues we don't have control over. And it's important, too, to look at the issue that you brought up in the beginning of the talk when you were talking about your daughter. So often we want to know why. We
Yeah.
want to know what we did wrong,
Yes.
what caused it, and how we're being punished to
Yeah.
bring this into our life. But life is really the lesson or the schools of the soul, the school of the soul. And so we're here to learn the lessons that our soul needs to have from the experience. And so even the negative experiences teach us something. And it is a process of going through the experiences of life instead of coming to know the reasons for every
Yes.
experience of life.
Yes, and as you said, very often it's the negative experiences of life from which we've truly learned because we pay more attention to those. And if we think of them as being learning experiences, then we can loose ourselves from the negativity more fully and just see what this was we were supposed to do and be joyous. And that's one thing so many people are so serious about life, that we need to be joyous and laugh more and be happy with whatever we have and be again, just be creatively joyous.
Mm-hmm. And to be able to be joyous in difficult circumstances sometimes causes us to have those misadventures or unhappy experiences so that we can become overcomers. That's the
Yes.
way that we become good at what we do. And it isn't something that God's doing. It isn't even something that the universe is doing. It's something that we're doing.
We're personally achieving in that way. And that's, if we can look at it in that way, then it makes problems more easy to bear because we can see that life is a school and we just have certain problems we have to work through. When we work through one, then we graduate to work through more difficult problems.
And the time that we waste trying to understand why. And in counseling, so often people, their questions have to do with why this has happened or why this has come about in my life. And so often that's, as you said earlier, the wrong question to be
Right.
asking. Instead, what is it that we're supposed to be doing?
That's
in
the
this?
important thing. What now? What now, Lord?
Mm-hmm.
And if we can remember to do that, then we don't beat ourselves over the head so much. And we don't expect too much of others around us because we accept just what is.
And God's role in this whole process doesn't become one of judging or sending good or sending bad or permitting. I heard someone talking recently, a religious leader, a very traditional religious leader, was talking about how God permits bad things to happen. And I thought that's a very dangerous road down which to walk, because, of course, then the question comes, well, what kind of God?
Yeah.
What kind of God permits this kind of thing to happen? And it isn't that God permits it. It's not that God doesn't prevent it. The fact is that God is a neutral force, and a neutral force for positive and for good. And so God's love for us doesn't change just because misfortune comes upon us. And after all, no matter what misfortune comes upon us, we transcend it even unto death.
Yeah.
So that we're really not dying, we're really not suffering to the extent that we believe we are. And that's not to minimize the fact that people do have tragedies and difficulties in life. And we certainly empathize with them and are compassionate and support them in that.
Indeed.
But what we want to allow people to do is to grow through the experience, to go through the experience, and to gain that insight that they need, instead of being in the experience and asking why it's happened and trying to justify why God would allow this to happen in my life.
Instead of patting them on the shoulder and saying, poor you, to let them see that they've had a wonderful experience, and this is a life and death, or wonderful experiences. I was talking with a young friend, Carol, whom you happen to know, last night, and she said that she was talking with someone who had been with Mother Teresa in India, and how terrible it is there that there's so many people dying, but it just happens that they all come there to die. And that's the way it works. And he saw it in a very clear light. But Carol said, she told him, I have a friend who really enjoys being with people when they die. And I said, who is that? And she said, you. And I thought that was interesting that she sees it in that light. But I do think it's a wonderful privilege to be with someone when they're going over, because we can help them raise their consciousness. And the way we go over determines how well we do on the inner in adjusting quickly. Because if we go over like heavily drugged, then we're out of it when we get over. And so we just can go, if we go over in full consciousness, you can see a difference on the faces of the people who have died, if they're going over in full consciousness, than if they're not. And I'm sure you've seen that in your experiences.
Sure. And being with people in the experience of death and dealing with death as a part of the life experience is very, very important. And we spend a lot of time in our ministry talking about death and dying, because it is such a normal part of human life, but it's such a part of human life that we pull away from and we're so afraid of. And so helping people to understand both the death process and understand even the illness process is a great challenge. And in New Thought, we have a lot of challenging work to do, because in New Thought, because of the fact that our faith is so positive, and because people understand the reality of the power of the mind, we're so enamored with the idea that we can change anything with our mind. We kind of have a Uri Geller consciousness. And there's nothing wrong with Uri Geller and bending spoons, but the fact is that when we do things with our mind that improves the physical life, we're talking about doing something that touches the spiritual being. And if the physical is changed, that's wonderful. But it isn't the purpose of spiritual truth to change the physical. The physical simply changes in conformity with spiritual reality. So if we have an instance where there's a tremendous amount of violence, for instance, and if we can change the consciousness of that environment to one of peace and tranquility, then the outer workings or the physical environment becomes calm because the spirit and the mind are calm. But we don't do it to bring about peace and calm in the physical. We do it because it is a spiritual truth and a spiritual dynamic. And it's very important, I think, for people to understand that, especially New Thought people and people of all faiths, that just because there isn't a physical manifestation doesn't mean that the power isn't working, and that these laws that we talk about of cause and effect are not operating. And certainly they are operating.
Exactly, exactly. It's so important that people realize what you just said is the truth of that, and adjust it to their own thinking and their own way of living. There would be a greater happiness in the world, and adjustment to the so-called negative things of life, if they could just remember those things. And I think their consciousness is being raised. The consciousness of humanity is being raised, and it's easier for people to grasp truth and live it, and more truth is coming through to more people, I believe, than ever before. I think we're close. The line, the veil, we might say it this way, the veil is getting thinner between the two worlds. We live in the third dimension. The veil is getting so much thinner between the third and fourth dimension.
And we're beginning to see more clearly.
Exactly.
And if we can attune our thinking and our thought and our spirituality to that fact, so many wonderful things can happen. In talking with people who are dying or talking with people who are seriously ill, so often even people of our own faith tradition, which many times are strong people in their religious fervor and faith, the most common question that people will ask is, and I'm sure you have the same experience, is, why did this happen to me? I don't understand why this is happening to me. And of course the response, which I would never say at the time because it's not appropriate and very few people are willing or ready to hear it, is that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Why not you? Why not me? Because the experience comes to teach us a lesson and to bring us deeper spiritual knowledge and awareness. And sometimes in the midst of our illness and in the midst of our suffering, we come to our greatest understanding of spiritual truth. And so we go back to the question of asking the correct question, and that's not, why did this happen, but what should I do now, now that I'm here? And so if we find ourselves faced with a serious illness, with a terminal illness, it isn't to wipe it out or to destroy it or even to understand it. It is to simply say, here's where I am. Now, it doesn't have power over me. It may have power over my physical body. If it's an economic challenge, it may have some consequences over my expenses or my financial life, but it does not have control over me. And if I attune my thoughts to the power and the presence of God, then I will be able to go through this process and this experience, and the karmic law that is operating at a level that I can't understand, that brought me to this point, is being fulfilled, and I'm moving on. And so that cycle of cause and effect is taking place, and we're not fighting it, and we're not changing it, but we're going through it and coming out on the other side having paid that debt.
That's so wonderfully clear and spoken with such clarity. I just wish that everyone could hear that and take it to heart, because there would be so much less fear in the world. And it's fear that holds us back. It's the fear that makes people have a hard time when they die, or when they're still living, to have a hard time. And we've both seen it, I know, a great deal, where if people are fearful, they're tense, and then they're experiencing pain more fully, and they go out in a very in a less than desirable way, because their spirit leaves when their body is still holding on to it. And we have pre-birth agreements before we come in that we're going to accomplish in our life, and unless we can go back and see what those pre-birth agreements were, then we just have to go on faith that all is well and all is going in our lives as planned, according to that pre-birth agreement.
And part of that faith is to accept things the way they are.
Right.
And not necessarily to fold our hands and give up, but accept things the way they are, and then to move on and to be guided and directed from that point forward. Kind of an example I think that most people, especially in the West, can relate to is the life of Christ Jesus. If we look at his life and put aside the theology, because we all get into trouble with theology about who he was and why he was here and what his death meant, because all of us from different traditions have different views of that. But if we look at the fact that in his life, from the beginning to the end, but especially focusing on the end of his life, where there were so many tragedies and so many sufferings and so many issues of isolation and ultimately death, and not a very desirable death, his reality was to deal with those experiences as we should deal with all experiences of life. That is, karmically, or cause and effect brought them into being. Whether it was the sins of the world or his sins or something he did or we did isn't the issue. The issue is how he dealt with the reality of the experience. He didn't ask, why am I being persecuted, and make a theological thesis of it. He simply accepted the fact that this is where I am, and in some cases didn't even defend himself. And in no case was he ever asking, well, why me? Why not Judas, or why not Peter, or why not John, or why not? In his life, he simply accepted that which came. And in the midst of every circumstance and situation, he knew that it was the result of a cause and an effect. sometimes over which he had some influence, other times over which he had no influence. Sometimes, I'm sure even in his infinite intelligence, some of the purposes he didn't understand or comprehend. But what he did was endure them with strength and with faith and with a resoluteness that didn't give in to the circumstance or situation, but that accepted it, centered in peace and centered in perfect harmony and balance, and went all the way through unto his death in the same way. Very magnificent way shower, as Mary
Yeah.
Baker Eddy would say, as to how we should deal with karmic law, how we should deal with cause and effect. Here's the example of the greatest human being and spiritual being that we know of.
Yeah.
And his example to us was that all of these tragedies and all of these misfortunes came, and in the midst of it, he just went through the experience in the now and was able to come out on the other side. And as he came out on the other side, the cause and effect, the things that caused these effects to come into being, both in the physical and spiritual world, took care of themselves. His role was to go through it.
Yeah.
And his role was to respond to it, and he did. And that's a wonderful example of what cause and effect is about, and what it is an issue of when tragedy and difficulty comes, not woe is me and getting somebody to help put the ashes on,
Yeah.
and all of the other things, but to simply endure it.
That is such a marvelous example, and he is our divine way shower. And if we look at his life as you explained it in its entirety, then we would use it as an example. And what is way shower but that? He gave us the example of how to live valiantly, fully, and as you said, he didn't question any of those things, because he knew that his time was pre-planned. It was preordained that he was to do this, and so he did it, and he did it well. And of course, he was of master degree when he came in, and so he knew a lot more intellectually than many people would know because of his high degree of spiritual advancement. But he lived it with such glorious courage to show us how to live.
And he had a pre-birth agreement,
Yes.
and we, of course, believe that we know what it is, but his response was to fulfill that.
Yes.
And he fulfilled it in all of the experiences of his life. And we have the same opportunity to be able to deal with ourselves and with the circumstances of life in the same way.
And if we can remain courageous, we can remain calm and peaceful and serene, and we can lift others by our own attitude and our own way of being, and help others to live a more valiant life in that way.
Most, I guess, we have to get ourselves into a change in the way that we think about the things that happen to us in life. And we have to change our way of thinking about this issue of sin and punishment,
Yes.
and judgment or cause and effect.
Yes, and a lot of the psychological teachers today are saying get yourself out of the way. And we might phrase it this way, to get that we're this physical iris is the little self, and the spiritual self is so much greater in each of us. So we have to get our little physical self out of the way and live from our higher self. And when we do, then we are living in full consciousness, and we are living according to divine law, with which we have an affinity from our higher state of being.
Why do you suppose people are so hesitant or neglect getting in touch with that higher self?
Well, I think, one, we don't know any better, and two, we think what you see is what you get. And so that's part of, they don't know any better. But it's part of our, it's so much more complicated than I could say in a few words, but I think there are light forces and dark forces in all of creativity, and the dark forces have worked to keep us subjugated, and the light forces have worked to help us be the greatest we can be. And there's always been that struggle within us and within the cosmos of light and dark, and good versus evil, light versus dark, and so forth. And it's not it's not light versus dark. It's negativity versus positive. It's truth versus non-truth. But if we didn't have that aspect of being, how would we grow? So it's not like, oh, isn't that a terrible thing that this exists? It just exists. It just is.
And the negative aspects of our life and the negative consciousness that we have tells us that this is all we have. The
Yes.
physical is all we have.
Yes.
And that that small I
A little self.
is the only reality. And yet that higher self is non-existent.
Yes. But when we pray, when we meditate, when we reach out to God the whole, we are opening our spiritual aspect of being and living from that vantage point. And so that's why it's so important that we have time, that we have time alone, that we have time to collect ourselves, that we have time for meditation, for tuning in to the divine within. Because so many people just stay so busy, so hectically busy every moment of every day and night that they don't have time to really look within. And it's only when we look within that we see how great we really are from the inner planes, how great our higher self is. Because the higher aspect of being is always so much greater than that little physical me or you or anyone.
And meditation and prayer certainly ground us and center us in that presence.
Exactly, exactly. They help us find who and what we are. They help us find our attunement with God the whole, with divinity. And so I know that those people who meditate, and many people meditate and don't even mention it, it's not something that is even brought out a great deal of time. I know many businessmen such as yourself who don't even acknowledge that they meditate, but they do, because they think it's just a personal thing.
It's a personal issue, and it's
Yeah.
a major part of people's lives and needs to be more a part of life. And Reverend Freelander and I have been sharing with you concepts about cause and effect and karmic law, and we hope you found this information to be useful. We look forward to seeing you next time.
Helps me be strong, confident living, comforts my heart. From such a blessing I can't depart. Confident living helps me expand visions of value, the kingdom at hand. Confident living, talent to win, gift of the Spirit moves from within. Confident